We are going to talk about nature today and all of the benefits that time in nature provides. And I know it's bitterly cold outside right now, so my caveat is be in nature when nature is most welcoming to us. That may not be next Tuesday when the high is expected to be 9 degrees Fahrenheit.
Screen because the bottom is cut off.
So, in recent years, I would say for the past 20 or so years, there has been an enormous amount of scientific information that confirms all of the ways that we humans benefit from spending time in nature. In fact, I try to keep up with the scientific literature, and it's too much because there are so many papers being produced on a monthly basis. And you know, it's not just the scientific literature where you see this. There are more and more popular journals and magazines that are now extolling how valuable it is to spend time in nature. The benefits of spending time in nature, why you should get outside more often. So a study that many of us who work in this field often cite is a 2017 paper by Howie Frumkin and Greg Bratman and other colleagues called Nature Contact and Human Health, a Research Agenda. And the reason why we often turn to this particular paper is that it really endeavored to list every single benefit that had been extolled in the scientific literature. And basically, these benefits came down to three major categories: the physiological, the psychological, and the behavioral. So some of the ones that are most commonly cited is that spending time in nature can reduce our stress levels, our anxiety levels, can reduce heart rate and pulse, can reduce levels of depression. So these are commonly cited, and then some of the other benefits that often are mentioned is that it can increase our cognition, our memory capacity, as well as overall behavioral characteristics like self-reported well-being, mood, optimism, things like that. So why do, yes, oh, that's wonderful. That woman has a copy of the book I'm about to cite. Great book. Why do we derive all of these benefits from spending time in nature? So one theory is based on what is called the biophilia hypothesis. There was a great biologist at Harvard for many, many years, E.O. Wilson. He spoke here at Cornell for a couple of times. I don't know if any of you got to see him. Wilson was a rare individual. And he advanced what you see there on the left, this biophilia hypothesis. And basically what it said was that we humans hold an innate relationship to all forms of living beings, and that the reason why we have those innate connections are because we evolved from a much earlier state where we needed to know what was out there because we needed to know what was edible, what threatened us, and what was poisonous. And we've lost most of that innate connection to the natural world, but according to Wilson, it still exists We just have to refine it in each of our lives. There, now it's going forward. So, the other thing that I want to mention is that nature does not have to involve an extensive trip into a state forest or a national forest or a forest primeval. Some of you may recognize that young boy on the left. And yes, that is me. I grew up in the prototypical post-World War II suburb of Levittown, New York, on Long Island, where the houses were small and packed together. But even there, I was able to explore our neighborhood parks, the local woodlands, even our own backyard. So really developed that love of green spaces from that very young age, even in as dense a suburban community as Levittown. And I also want to point out that nature can be a social magnet, even in as dense an urban environment as Manhattan in New York City, because as people relax in nature and feel comfortable and supported by it, the tensions and anxieties that lead to things like arguments and road rage can melt away, and people can enjoy lying on a blanket in the big green sheep meadow at Central Park, as these folks are doing here. So that book, The Well-Gardened Mind, that you have a copy of, the author, Sue Stewart Smith, states, being out and about on busy city streets means having to process a lot of information, a lot of auditory as well as visual information, and it disrupts our ability to focus. Horns, sirens, alarms are all intended to bring people on alert and keep them safe, but they drain our energy in trying to filter them out. Navigating a tide of people on busy pavement is exhausting at the best of times. Everyone is going at a different pace. Both our physical and mental space is under threat in different ways in the city environment. And any of you who have ever walked in Midtown Manhattan can relate to that statement. So, now that I've introduced you to some of the scientific bases for nature benefits, I'd like to share research that I and colleagues have conducted that demonstrates how these benefits relate to us people in different stages of life. And I will start with the effect of nature on children. You know, this topic of re-engaging children with nature really saw a prominence in 2005 when a then journalist named Richard Louv wrote a book called Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Funny side note about this book, I know Richard Louv, and we've had a number of conversations about this, and he said that after he had finished writing Last Child in the Woods, his editor developed this term of nature deficit disorder. And Louv said, oh, well, that's never gonna catch on. I don't wanna use that. The editor insisted on it and was correct, because it has become a very prominent term now. So this was a seeming call to arms to get our kids away from video screens, out of their rooms, out of their school rooms, and out into nature. And Louvre has written a number of books related to this theme in the years since 2005. So what he so effectively argued in this and in his subsequent books is that from a very young age, children benefit from interacting with nature. It empowers them. It feeds their innate curiosity. And I'm really pleased that all 6 of our young grandchildren, including Magnolia, pictured there at Venata Watershed, love spending time in nature.
Do you mind if I steal Magnolia?
You know Magnolia?
No, I said, do you mind if I steal
Ah, no, I
Magnolia?
think her parents would be somewhat resentful of that.
Yeah,
Well-
yeah, I know, but, you know, there was the movie Steal Magnolia.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, this Magnolia is not up for adoption,
Okay.
nor is her sister Juniper, because their mother Iris would be very resentful. So that is our horticultural family.
Okay, well, anyway.
So many psychological authorities now believe that the window of opportunity for the formation of a deep relationship with nature happens most critically in what we call the middle childhood years, like 8 until about 12. And that period has apparently been shown to be a critical one in terms of adopting practices that people will keep throughout their lives. So, a worrisome feature of our contemporary society is that many children in their middle childhood years are increasingly spending their time on screens, isolated in their bedrooms. If they're reading fantasy books, which is great, but not in isolation from nature. And we do know that exposure to nature can have a direct effect on children's learning. So quick quiz, which of these 2 schoolyards do you think has a greater impact of trying to support children's learning? Not a difficult quiz. So researchers at the University of Illinois Landscape and Human Health Lab have for the past several years been conducting something called the Capacity to Learn study. In this study, because we do now have such an emphasis on testing of young people, they decided, okay, we're gonna go beyond which of these 2 schoolyards do kids and their teachers prefer. We're actually going to study a large number of green schoolyards and schoolyards which unfortunately still are filled in concrete, and actually look at student test scores over time. And they found some irrefutable evidence that those students who are regularly given time in a green schoolyard actually have overall higher test scores in English and in math. So that's pretty definitive that that time is worthwhile. Yes?
Can I assume the study was controlled for socioeconomics? Because one looks like a much more upscale community than the other.
It's a great question, and yes, the study was controlled for all socioeconomic factors, and what Professor Kuo and her colleagues found was that even in more middle-class urban communities in Philadelphia and Chicago, there still are a lot of these. This computer seems to be moving on its own, which is interesting. Seriously, what are you doing?
spot to put raised beds.
You're touching the screen.
It's a tough deal.
No, I'm actually not touching the screen, just not quite sure why it's gone haywire on me. I wonder if that wonderful, AV person, Joe, is still available to us. Because it does not seem to, oh, there it goes. Oh, goody, good.
I'm using just the arrows.
Good, yes, okay, I think we're good now. So, over the years, going back to my earliest days at Cooperative Extension, I developed an absolute immunity to things going wrong with slideshows. So I never get upset by them because I just figure they're inevitable and somehow we'll work our way out of it. So we do now know that young people learn best and show the greatest enthusiasm for learning when they are regularly exposed to the outdoors. And you know, the outdoors is one great big learning lab. So when young kids observe the behavior of praying mantises, or watch robins catching worms, or follow the trajectory of dandelion seeds, they are engaging in what is known as STEM education: science, technology, engineering, and math. And what better way for them to be learning these basic lessons than observing how the natural world works? One of the big names in research on children and nature for a number of decades has been this individual, Louise Chawla. She's now an emeritus professor at the University of Colorado, and she summarized her decades of work in a 2015 paper, which I will quote from. It was called "The Benefits of Time in Nature, Contact for Children." And she stated, this is being difficult, but I will work around that. A compelling body of evidence exists that trees and natural areas are essential elements of healthy communities for children. They need to be integrated at multiple scales, from landscaping around homes to green schoolyards. These are essential for the health and well-being of young people. And according to a 2020 study that was done by Barrera Hernandez and colleagues, when young people have a greater connection to the natural world, they're more likely to develop pro-environmental, sustainable behaviors like recycling, composting, reducing their use of plastics. So it's not only contributing to the learning of young people, to their excitement about discovery. Having young people spend time in nature can actually influence their pro-environmental behavior as they mature. So this actually relates to another study that I conducted with Cornell colleagues, in which we found a positive correlation between the level of nature engagement in the middle childhood years and the degree of nature involvement in current Cornell undergraduates. And we did find that those students who went to a nature-based summer camp or went out regularly with parents or relatives to neighborhood parks and green spaces, those individuals, based on a multi-hundred person survey we did, were more likely to spend time outside in the green spaces of Cornell now that they're undergraduates. Now, an interesting and disturbing side part of that study was we also asked questions of the students about how important they felt it was to spend time in nature. And an overwhelming majority did say that they felt that it was important. However, a great many of the respondents said they spend less time in nature than they would like. And that really speaks to how busy they are with courses and relationships and all of that. We know today that young people show greater levels of stress and anxiety relative to even 1 or 2 decades ago. And there are multiple factors that play into this. Parents' growing focus on academic achievement over play, increased time in class with decreases in what we used to call recess, increased use of electronic technology and screen time, both in school and while home. So this habitual stress that can develop in the middle childhood and teen years can carry over, and often does carry over, into the college years. As a retired university faculty member, I've been particularly concerned about the well-being of young people and how these research findings relate to their health today. So I'm going to warn you that this is the depressing part of today's presentation, but it becomes more uplifting after this. The Center for Collegiate Mental Health has reported recently that nearly 1/3 of students seeking care while in college were previously, prior to college, on some form of psychotropic medication. And 1 in 10%, had been hospitalized previously for psychiatric reasons. As a result, the 2025 National Collegiate Health Assessment, which is conducted by the American College Health Association, reported that 76% of respondents, better than 3/4, indicated that they had felt either moderate or severe stress in the previous 12 months. Now, we all know being a college student has to involve a certain degree of stress, but when it becomes moderate to severe, that really is of concern. So, to address these student health issues, a number of years ago, in 2019 to be precise, colleagues at Cornell and I established the Nature RX program, whose mission is to reduce stress and thereby increase physical and mental health in students through their engagement with nature. Components of the program include the prescribing of time in nature by health professionals at Cornell Health. That is now a box to be checked on the student's health record, which is an accomplishment that took a number of years, so we're very pleased about that. A student-led Nature RX club that engages in a number of activities throughout the year. A Nature RX course that I started, which has now been taken over by colleagues of mine. And e-postering in dorms and other sites around campus that addresses all of the benefits of time in nature that I've been speaking with you about. And finally, a way of engaging in direct nature-related research. Also, as Kim mentioned in her gracious introduction, together with my colleague, Dr. Dorothy Evis at William & Mary, we created and co-direct the Campus Nature RX Network, which now includes nearly 80 colleges and universities around the US and Canada. So each school has a unique approach to their Nature RX program, but all of us are united in a fundamental belief that there is value in encouraging students to spend time in nature. That colleges and universities have an innate responsibility to promote not just the intellectual development of their students, but also those young people's overall well-being. And we feel that Nature RX is one way of doing that. I'm also the co-author, along with the former Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at Cornell, Dr. Gregory Eels, of the text Nature RX, Improving College Student Mental Health, and that was published by Cornell University Press. In it, we go in depth into this crisis of psychological well-being of students that I've been speaking about. We discuss the proven benefits of time in nature. We provide a step-wide guide to developing a Nature RX program, and we profile 4 campuses, including Cornell, that have successfully developed Nature RX programs. And actually, at this time, I would like to give Longview a copy of that book.
If you got another one, just hold it up so we can see what it looks like.
Kim, can we just hold that up so we can see what it looks like?
Looks like that.
Cover.
Oh,
yes.
Yes, one that's on the screen.
Yep.
Yeah. I have my copy you gave me this summer.
Great. So, we've been talking about young children, we've been talking about college-aged students. Let's switch now to discussing the benefit of nature doses on adults. Excuse me. Multiple studies in recent years have shown that when people live closer to green and blue spaces, and what we mean by blue spaces are lakes, rivers, creeks, oceans, that people tend to spend significantly more time in physical activity and have more rapid restoration when recovering from injuries. So living closer to green and blue spaces, you're likely to spend more time outdoors, and you're likely to have a quicker recovery time from injuries. And by the way, I can provide, Kim, for any of you who are doubting my words, with the citations on which I base all of these studies. So still other studies have compared the effect of indoor versus outdoor exercise. Let's say that you exercise for 45 minutes in a gym, or you're outside walking or running through a wooded area for that same amount of time. A 2013 study by Mitchell and colleagues concluded that, quote, physical activity in natural environments is in fact associated with a reduction in the risk of poor mental health to a greater degree than the same physical activity in other environments. So there really is something to this nature thing. We are moving up in age, so let us now discuss the effect of nature on the senior audience, one that I have joined. We do live in an aging population. Around 14% of the population of the US currently is age 65 or over, but that percentage is expected to double in the next 20 years as members of the baby boomer generation join this generation. So as the percentage of the elder population increases, the benefits of living near green or blue spaces become more and more apparent. But at the same time, the number of people living in towns and cities, urbanized and urban areas, is somewhere around 80%. So finding those green and blue spaces can sometimes be particularly challenging. In a research brief that was written by my friend Kathleen Wolfe and her colleague Elizabeth Housley, they reported that older individuals with access to nature showed increased participation in outdoor physical activities, as that previous study has shown, improved mental health and cognitive functioning, and an increase in social interaction with those around them and their community. And that last point is so important because we do live in a society where for every age cohort, loneliness is becoming more of an issue. And if spending time in nature with a friend or relative allows us to feel more connected, that in itself is so valuable. There was another study that I read recently based in Taiwan that focused on visitors to a particular nature preserve who were at least 65 years of age and who visited the park at least once a week. Participants in that study were asked a range of questions, from whether they felt supported by others around them, to how much they thought about their futures, to how much purpose they felt in their lives. The researchers found that those people who discussed their experiences in nature with others regularly felt that their lives had greater meaning, they were more enthusiastic about life, they looked forward to each day to a greater degree.
Greater extent.
And recently, the New York Times reported on the health benefits of bird watching, something that my wife and I engage in regularly. As that article stated, spending time outdoors with a pair of binoculars is good for your body and soul. When did the New York Times start to talk about your soul? That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, while one can enjoy watching birds through a living room window, birding often involves getting out and moving around. And older adults are the least active segment of the population, are less likely to spend time outdoors than any other age group. A recently published study used data about physical activity for thousands of American and Chinese adults. So the study was done both with residents of this country and in China among older adults. And they found that even a little bit of extra physical activity outdoors can have a major impact on lifespan, on longevity.
Are you entertaining questions?
I would love to have questions either now or when I finish up in just a few minutes.
Now, or you're saying, I was just wondering, when you gave the interesting information about this study in Formosa and
Yes.
elsewhere, part of the problem for the people that you're addressing who are here and people who are considering coming here is they can't walk.
Yes.
They can't get outside, so how is that handled?
Right. So I know that Longview is a fully accessible facility, So whether one is using a walker or a wheelchair, it is possible to get outside. I know that firsthand because my sister-in-law had until very recently resided here and had very limited mobility. I have a second part of my response to that question that's going to come up in 2 slides. Because I'd like to talk next about gardening. And it's another activity that can provide a number of benefits for seniors, including for physical health. So types of movement that are involved in gardening, and I'm a very active gardener myself. Bending, lifting, digging, reaching, all of these are wonderful for maintaining physical agility and toning. These activities also provide an excellent workout for our muscles, our joints, our bones. They help with overall strength, flexibility, and balance. So important. Gardening also offers the opportunity for seniors to soak up vitamin D on those days when we actually do have sunshine outside. And vitamin D is so important in terms of our mineral uptake.
And quality of the food that you get.
And the quality of the food that one can eat, absolutely, if one is growing one's own food. Yes, ma'am?
Here I am again. Perhaps you don't know that Longview has instituted a program to facilitate gardening by people living here, and that they can have a box at their apartment, and if they're in a wheelchair, they can easily reach into the box and so on. So it's a real plus for people that are considering coming here, that they can have that kind of access to gardening.
Well, you've actually preempted my big surprise announcement, which is that Kim has shared with me that this spring, Longview is going to be actually constructing a dedicated gardening area that will be fully accessible, where each of the garden plots will be a raised bed that will be accessible from a wheelchair or a walker, or for those using canes, and that the staff will work with residents on the development of their individual gardens. So that's a wonderful new development here at Longview.
Well, these boxes that I just mentioned are not quite covered by what you just said. In other words, the people can be in their apartments
Yes.
and have a full-size, waist-high garden. You're telling about something even more interesting in that you're talking about a flat garden?
A
garden on the ground?
dedicated garden area, and what this means is that residents will have a couple of options, either an individual box associated with
Well, the box is wonderful
their
in the
unit, or as part of this gardening area, which for those who prefer that can provide certain benefits in terms of socialization. Because we all know that community gardens breed socializing. Oh, what are you growing there? Tell me about that crop. So that type of interaction can be so valuable. So as seniors become fully engaged in gardening, it can provide very much of a in-the-moment experience. We all have concerns, we all have worries in our lives, but when you're gardening, a lot of that can melt away as you're focused exclusively on the planting, the pest control, and ultimately the satisfying harvesting. So another study that colleagues and I conducted a few years ago looked at the question, what is the minimum time dose in nature to have a positive impact on mental health, and in our case, we focused on college students. So we did what is called a scoping review of a great many published papers. And what we found from the 14 papers that had directly addressed this question is that as little as 10 minutes to 30 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week, can positively impact our stress levels, our salivary cortisol levels, which are an indicator of stress level, anxiety levels. So you don't, the bottom line message is you don't need to spend a great deal of time out in nature, whether it's walking in the woods or playing in a garden, in order to derive these benefits. So, in conclusion, through outdoor physical activities, including walking, gardening, swimming perhaps, we can each improve our physical and mental well-being in ways that are suitable for our current capabilities. So, I thank you for your attention, and yes, at this point, I would be happy to answer additional questions.
Where's that one from, that picture?
You know, I'm not sure. That's such a good question. I've used this slide many times, and I really should know where that's from. It's very beautiful.
I think it's the.
Is it Cornell?
It's the A.D. White House garden.
I don't think it's the A.D. White House Gardens, but perhaps
The
so.
one from Tower Road that
Yes,
leads up to those.
Right, could be. Other questions? Yes.
I had 2 questions, excuse me, about your studies. One, as you talked about being out in nature, and I think of what I've enjoyed here locally. For example, when you walk at Taganic, they've got the placards that will tell you different things about the peregrine falcons or dragonflies or
Yes.
whatever. And I find that not only makes it more pleasurable, and I feel like I can go farther, it gives you a little natural break. Have any of the studies looked at that kind of sort of interactive feature, and how that impacts being in nature?
It's a fascinating question. I'm not aware of studies that have looked specifically at the interpretation of nature, which is really what you're describing, and how that impacts the benefits of spending that time in nature.
Yeah.
I will say that as someone who is very familiar with all of the trees in the forest and the insects and diseases that they harbor, it's actually more challenging for me to have that totally immersive experience in nature where I don't want to go into the whole Kaplan's theory of nature, but where you are no longer focused on the mental aspects
More
of
meditative
life,
than that,
but
yeah.
are instead just enjoying the beauty. My concern about over-interpreting nature is that it would do just that. You become so engrossed in the life cycle of the dragonfly that you're no longer really appreciating the sounds, the looks, the aromas of that natural experience.
Yeah, I'd love to see a study on that. And then the other one you touched on, and that's the idea of, vitamin D, et cetera. Have they looked at time spent in an environment where there's a lot of sunshine and a longer daylight, and ones that might be, West Coast Seattle rain all the time and cloudy all the time? Has that ever been?
Yeah, actually more extreme than that. There have been studies that have contrasted residents living, say, here in the Northeast with those who live in high latitude environments where there is essentially no sunlight during the long winter months, and how, so the one study that I'm thinking of looked at how being out in nature for those in, say,
Finland.
Scandinavia, it has less impact on them during the winter than people who go cross-country skiing here in winter, because we do still have
Plenty of
some
sunshine.
sunlight.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, yes.
It's interesting, we had a presentation by another Cornell, a woman who works in, design consideration of buildings and things, and talking about how important it is to have light that comes in, wind as it comes in.
Yes.
Plants in the atrium and in the different places throughout the building, and how that has the nature effect on it too.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, and that was probably one of my colleagues like Nancy Wells or one of her associates. There is more and more work being done now on green buildings, and when we talk about green buildings, it's not just having them have very low external power use and water use, it's also greening those buildings, bringing plants inside, increasing the window exposure, especially on the south and west sides, so that you're looking out into nature. Those are so important. And if any of you ever find yourselves in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Phipps Conservatory is considered the greenest public garden in the world right now. And it has done all of those things in their Center for Livable Landscapes. And it's fascinating to see. I think we have time for one more question. I thought you had your hand up, I'm sorry. Do we have one more, sir?
It's a bit of a flip. Some time ago, I was looking at the effect of the industrialization on an area, and came across information on the amount of income that comes to a community from bird watchers.
Yes,
It's enormous.
it is. Birding is, excuse me, considered the second most followed hobby or avocation in America. We are fortunate to live in the same town as the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, considered the most important ornithological research center in the US, but I know that every other week I'm heading off to buy another 40-pound bag of sunflower seeds. So I'm definitely contributing to that economic powerhouse.
John and I are happy to take care of our almost 8-year-old grandson. Every Wednesday we meet him at the school when he gets off the school bus, and he and his parents live out in the country near Trumansburg, and we find that once he gets off the bus and you know, drops off his backpack, he needs to be outdoors for maybe riding his bicycle around or hanging out in the woods, and then he can come in and you know, hear a story or play with his toys or help me cook dinner and things. So that,
Well, that's wonderful to hear that an 8-year-old has that need
he's had it
to be
for
outdoors.
ever since he's
It's genetic.
yeah.
Well, genetic, based on his grandparents or his parents
Yeah.
have really promoted
Yeah.
that love of the outdoors. And I see it also in my grandchildren. I don't quite understand it, but even now in the midst of winter, our 2 10-year-old granddaughters, when we watch them on either Monday or Wednesday afternoons, are dressed in t-shirts and shorts and want to go outside. I don't get it, but it's great. Well, you've been a wonderfully attentive audience. I'm so glad to have had this opportunity to share some thoughts about the benefits of nature with you all. I look forward to your new dedicated garden space in the spring, and I hope that you all have a good rest of the winter. Thank you.